In the autumn of 1983, a retired intelligence analyst named Arthur Colden Weiss walked into an acoustics laboratory at a university in Maryland and asked a professor he had never met to listen to something that existed nowhere except inside his own memory. He had no tape. He had no recording. What he had was his voice, and 30 years of practice reproducing 11 seconds of sound he had heard exactly once, on a winter night in 1953, through a set of government headphones at a listening post outside Fort Meade. The professor thought, at first, that this was some kind of test, or perhaps a joke, arranged by a colleague. It was not a joke. By the end of that afternoon, according to notes the professor kept privately for years afterward, he was no longer sure what he had just listened to, and he was even less sure what to do with that uncertainty. This is where the story has to begin, because everything that follows depends on a single, strange fact. Arthur Weiss did not bring evidence to that laboratory. He brought himself. He had spent 3 decades turning his own throat, his own memory, his own discipline, into the only remaining copy of something the United States government had officially processed, filed, and, according to every record that can be located today, quietly allowed to vanish. According to family members who spoke about him after his death, and according to a small number of personal notebooks that were not discovered until 2009, Arthur Weiss was 22 years old in December of 1953, working the overnight shift as a junior signals intelligence analyst attached to a communications intercept unit near Fort Meade, Maryland. His job, as his son later described it, was tedious by design, headphones on for hours at a time, frequencies swept methodically across designated bands, anomalies logged, time-stamped, and forwarded up the chain for people with higher clearances to decide what mattered and what did not. It was, by every account, a job built around repetition. Nothing was supposed to happen. And then, according to Weiss, something did. He described it, decades later, in careful and almost clinical language, the way a technician describes a malfunction, rather than the way a man describes an encounter. At approximately 2 in the morning, during a routine sweep of a frequency range he was authorized but not specifically instructed to monitor that night, he picked up 11 seconds of structured sound, not static, not atmospheric interference, not any of the recognizable signatures of foreign radio traffic that his training had spent months teaching him to identify. He described it as layered, as though multiple tones were arriving simultaneously rather than in sequence, and he used a word that his son says he returned to again and again across the decades. He called it woven. The signal did not repeat. This is the detail that Weiss apparently found most difficult to reconcile, and it is worth sitting with, because it is the detail that turns an ordinary anomaly into something else. Radio interference repeats, or drifts, or fades according to identifiable physical patterns. A malfunctioning piece of equipment produces the same error again. What Weiss described was singular. 11 seconds, once, and then the frequency returned to what he called, in one of his later notebooks, ordinary silence, as though something had simply closed a door. Standard procedure at a facility like the one Weiss worked in was not ambiguous. Anomalous intercepts were to be recorded on reel-to-reel tape, logged with timestamp and frequency data, and forwarded through a chain of custody to analysts with higher clearance levels than a 22-year-old junior technician possessed. According to Weiss's own account, that is exactly what he did. He filed the intercept report. He noted the frequency range, the duration, and his own assessment that the signal did not correspond to any known transmission type in the reference material available to him. 2 weeks later, according to a fragment of correspondence his son located among his father's papers, the report came back through internal channels marked with a notation Weiss interpreted as meaning the matter had been reviewed and closed. He was told, verbally, by a superior whose name he chose never to record in writing, that the intercept had been reclassified as probable atmospheric phenomena, and that no further action was required. That should have been the end of it. For most young analysts in that position, it likely would have been. But Arthur Weiss did something that his family says defined the rest of his professional life. Before the tape was taken from him and logged into whatever archive received it, he listened to it, according to his own later account, no fewer than 40 times during the 2 weeks it remained in his possession. And somewhere in that repetition, without any plan to do so, he began to memorize it. Not the meaning of it, because he insisted for the rest of his life that he never determined whether it had meaning at all. He memorized its shape, its rhythm, the specific rise and fall of what he called its layered tones. He said, according to his son, that it was like memorizing a piece of music you have only heard once, except that the music refused to leave. What happened to the original recording after it left Arthur Weiss's hands is one of the central unresolved threads of this investigation, and it deserves to be addressed directly rather than assumed. According to publicly available information about signals intelligence archival procedures during the early Cold War period, intercepted material considered significant was typically transferred to centralized storage facilities, cataloged according to internal classification systems that themselves were often classified. There is no publicly available evidence confirming what specific archive received the December 1953 intercept, whether it still exists in any form, or whether it was ever formally declassified, downgraded, or destroyed, according to standard records retention schedules of the period. What can be said, based on records requests filed decades later, is that the trail goes cold, with unusual completeness, for a document that, according to Weiss, was processed through entirely normal channels. For the remainder of the 1950s, according to notebooks that begin appearing in the family's possession starting around 1955, Weiss did not speak about the intercept to colleagues. He continued his career, moving through a series of assignments that his son describes only in general terms, citing continued security restrictions even decades after his father's retirement. But privately, in notebooks he kept at home, rather than at any facility, he began something that can only be described as a private research project, conducted entirely from memory. He would reproduce the 11 seconds vocally, as closely as he could manage, and then attempt to break it down using whatever analytical frameworks were available to a self-taught signals analyst, working after hours in a home office in suburban Maryland. The notebooks themselves, which surfaced only after Weiss's death, and were shared in part with researchers investigating unresolved signals intelligence cases, show a level of obsessive precision that several people who have examined them describe as unusual, even by the standards of a trained intelligence professional. Page after page contains hand-drawn waveform approximations, frequency estimates written and crossed out and rewritten, and comparisons to known transmission types that Weiss apparently ruled out one by one over a period of years. Morse-derived systems, number station formats, which were already a known phenomenon within the intelligence community by the mid-1950s. Ionospheric skip patterns that could theoretically produce layered auditory artifacts. Weiss appears to have systematically tested his memory of the signal against every explanation his professional training could offer, and according to the notebooks, none of them fit cleanly. There is a particular entry, dated in the notebooks to sometime in 1961, that researchers who have reviewed the material tend to return to. Weiss writes, in handwriting his son later confirmed as his father's, that he has begun to suspect the signal was not damaged or degraded in any way that would explain its unfamiliarity. He writes that it sounded, in his words, complete, not like a fragment of a longer transmission that happened to be intercepted mid-sequence, but like something whole that had simply arrived and then stopped. This distinction mattered enormously to Weiss, according to his son, because a fragment implies a system Weiss simply hadn't identified yet. A complete, self-contained 11-second event implies something else, something Weiss apparently never allowed himself to name directly in writing, at least not in any notebook that has been recovered. Here the investigation has to widen, because Arthur Weiss's account, however meticulously documented in his own private notebooks, does not exist in isolation. Researchers examining signals intelligence archives from the same general period and region have identified what they describe as a documentary gap. Records from Fort Meade area signals intercept operations covering the years 1953 through 1955 show inconsistencies that several archivists, speaking to researchers over the years, have described as unusual relative to the record-keeping standards of adjacent periods. This is not proof of concealment. Record-keeping in any large institution is imperfect, and gaps of this kind can and do occur for mundane administrative reasons, including reorganizations, facility relocations, and the routine culling of material deemed low priority. But the gap exists, and it exists specifically across the window that contains the intercept Weiss described. What makes this gap harder to dismiss as ordinary administrative erosion is a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2010, not by Weiss himself, who had died the previous year, but by his grandson, a man in his late 20s at the time who had grown up hearing fragments of his grandfather's story and decided, after Weiss's death, to attempt something his grandfather never formally did himself. He requested any records pertaining to signals intercepts logged at facilities associated with Fort Meade during December 1953, citing the approximate date and general frequency range his grandfather had documented in the recovered notebooks. The response he received, according to correspondence he later shared with researchers, stated that no responsive records could be located matching the description provided, not that the records were classified and therefore withheld, which is a common and legally distinct response in Freedom of Information Act proceedings. The response indicated the records simply could not be found. There is a meaningful difference between a government telling a citizen it cannot share something and a government telling a citizen that something does not appear to exist. Weiss's grandson has said publicly that this distinction is what convinced him his grandfather's account deserved to be taken seriously, even though he is careful, in every interview he has given, to say that he does not know what his grandfather heard and does not claim to know what it means. By 1983, 30 years after the intercept, Arthur Weiss had retired from a long career in signals intelligence work, the specifics of which remain only partially disclosed in the public record. According to his son, retirement gave him, for the first time, both the freedom and the peace of mind to pursue the question that had occupied him privately for 3 decades. He reached out to a professor of acoustics at a university in Maryland, a man whose name has been withheld from public discussion at the request of surviving family members who describe him as a private person uninterested in association with speculative subject matter. What is known is that this professor agreed to meet with Weiss, and that the meeting, according to notes the professor apparently kept and later shared with a small number of colleagues, was unlike any consultation he had conducted before. Weiss did not bring a recording because none existed in his possession. What he did instead, according to the professor's notes, as they have been described secondhand by people who reviewed them, was reproduce the 11-second sequence vocally, as precisely as 3 decades of internal rehearsal allowed him to manage. The professor recorded this vocal reproduction and subjected it to spectral analysis using laboratory equipment available at the time. This is, on its face, a deeply imperfect scientific process. A human voice attempting to replicate a complex, layered auditory event from 30-year-old memory cannot be treated as equivalent to an original recording, and any responsible researcher examining this case has to hold that limitation firmly in view. Memory degrades. Reproduction introduces error. What the professor was analyzing, strictly speaking, was not the 1953 signal but Arthur Weiss's memory of it. Filtered through his vocal cords, filtered again through analog recording equipment, filtered a third time through the interpretive judgment of a scientist working from an inherently compromised source. And yet, according to the account that has circulated among a small circle of researchers who have examined fragments of the professor's notes, the analysis produced a result that Weiss's son describes his father discussing with unusual seriousness for the remainder of his life. The spectral characteristics of Weiss's vocal reproduction, layered and structured in the way Weiss had always described, did not resemble any known synthetic or mechanically generated waveform pattern the professor tested it against. This much aligns with what a skeptic would expect. since a human voice cannot easily replicate machine-generated tonal structures with precision. But according to the same second-hand account, the professor also noted that the pattern did not resemble typical vocal or biological sound production either, once the analysis accounted for and attempted to strip away the inherent characteristics of a human voice imitating something. What remained, in the professor's own private assessment, as it has been relayed by those who read his notes, was neither cleanly artificial nor cleanly organic. The professor reportedly never published anything on the subject and, according to people who knew him, declined for the rest of his career to discuss the consultation publicly. There is no publicly available evidence confirming the specific data or methodology used in this informal analysis, and it should be treated as an unverified professional impression rather than a peer-reviewed finding. Weiss himself, according to his son, did not treat this consultation as confirmation of anything extraordinary. He treated it, characteristically, as one more data point in an investigation that had never produced a conclusion he was willing to commit to paper. His son recalls that his father's final assessment, delivered sometime in the mid-1980s, was almost frustratingly restrained. He said, according to his son's recollection, that he had ruled out everything he knew how to rule out, and that what remained was simply the honest limit of his own understanding. He never used the word extraterrestrial in front of his family, not once, according to every person who has spoken publicly about knowing him. He used, instead, a phrase his son remembers clearly. He called it unaccounted for. There is a thread in this story that widens the mystery in a direction few people examining Weiss's case have publicly connected, and it deserves to be raised here with appropriate caution. Separately documented accounts from the same general period describe individuals working in adjacent technical fields in the American Southwest who reported unusual experiences connected to low-frequency signal work. One such account, involving a private electronics engineer who later described decades of what he called ongoing contact beginning in 1953, centers on work with low-frequency signal receivers whose specific bandwidth applications were, according to that account, unusual for civilian use during the period. Researchers examining both cases independently have noted cautiously that the general time frame and the general category of technical work, low-frequency signal reception during the early to mid-1950s, appear in both narratives. This should not be overstated. There is no established, verified connection between Arthur Weiss's intercept and any other individual case from this period. The overlap may be coincidental, a natural consequence of how much technical signals work was occurring across military and private sectors during the early Cold War buildup of American surveillance and communications infrastructure. But researchers who study these cases as a body rather than in isolation have suggested that patterns of this kind, technical professionals working with unusual frequency ranges reporting unexplained events during the same narrow historical window, warrant closer comparative examination than they have so far received. What cannot be disputed is the shape of the silence that surrounds Arthur Weiss's account, and silence, in an investigation like this one, carries its own kind of evidentiary weight, even when it cannot be quantified or cited. Weiss did not go public during his working career, which is unsurprising given the security obligations attached to his profession. But he also did not go public after retirement, when many others in his position have chosen to speak. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoir. He approached, as far as anyone has been able to establish, exactly one outside expert, in private, and then returned to a life that his son describes as otherwise entirely ordinary. He worked in his garden, he attended church with his wife. He rarely mentioned the intercept even within his own household, and his son says he learned the fuller story only gradually, in fragments, over years of quiet conversation that his father seemed to offer only when he judged the moment right, never all at once. This pattern, a professional lifetime of near-total silence, punctuated by a single, carefully chosen act of disclosure, late and private, and deliberately limited in scope, echoes across a surprising number of accounts connected to unexplained phenomena from this same general era. Researchers who study testimonial patterns in this field have observed that many individuals connected to anomalous military or intelligence experiences during the 1940s and 1950s appear to have waited until either retirement or the final years of life before speaking, and even then typically chose a single trusted recipient rather than any public platform. Whether this pattern reflects genuine institutional pressure, the ordinary psychological weight of carrying an unresolved and professionally embarrassing memory, or some combination of both, remains, honestly, unknown. It is not proof of anything specific, but it is a consistent enough shape, appearing across enough independently documented cases, that it becomes difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Arthur Colden Weiss died in 2009, at the age of 78, in a hospital outside Baltimore. According to his son, he remained mentally sharp until the final weeks of his life, and the subject of the 1953 intercept came up, unprompted, during one of their last conversations. His son says his father seemed, in that final conversation, less interested in whether anyone would ever believe him than in whether the 11 seconds themselves would survive him in any form. He had, by that point, spent 56 years carrying a sound that existed nowhere else. No tape survived. No official record could later be located that matched his description. The only remaining copy, however imperfect, however filtered through memory and vocal reproduction and an unpublished laboratory consultation from 1983, was a version reconstructed entirely inside one man's mind and preserved, imperfectly, in a handful of private notebooks his family did not fully understand until after he was gone. His grandson, the same man who filed the unsuccessful Freedom of Information Act request in 2010, has said in the limited public statements he has made on the subject that he does not know what his grandfather heard that night near Fort Meade. He does not claim it was extraterrestrial in origin. He does not claim it was a foreign transmission, a natural phenomenon, or an artifact of faulty equipment, though he acknowledges that any of these remain plausible, mundane explanations that cannot be definitively ruled out given the available evidence. What he says instead is that he cannot explain why the records his grandfather described filing through entirely standard procedure appear to no longer exist in any accessible government archive. He cannot explain why a professionally disciplined, security-cleared intelligence analyst would spend 3 decades of his private life reconstructing 11 seconds of sound from memory if he believed, even privately, that it was nothing more than atmospheric noise. And he cannot explain, sitting with his grandfather's notebooks today, why the handwriting in the earliest pages, written by a 22-year-old junior analyst in the winter of 1953 or shortly after, already carries the same careful, restrained, almost defensive precision that would characterize every page that followed for the next 50 years. What remains in the end is not a recording. It is not a transcript, a waveform, or a piece of physical evidence that can be independently verified by anyone outside the small circle of people who read Arthur Weiss's notebooks or who briefly consulted with him in 1983. What remains is the testimony of a disciplined, professionally trained observer, corroborated only by the shape of an official silence that has never been adequately explained, and by the quiet, consistent behavior of a man who chose, for more than 50 years, to treat an 11-second sound as something worth protecting rather than something worth forgetting. Was it a transmission from something beyond ordinary explanation? Or was it simply an unusual atmospheric event that a brilliant, meticulous mind refused to let go of for the rest of his life? The government records that might answer that question cannot currently be located. The man who could answer it most directly is no longer alive to ask, and somewhere, if Arthur Weiss's own account is to be believed, 11 seconds of something once arrived, once, in the middle of an ordinary winter night, and then, just as deliberately, stopped.